came up only because thank you, Jim. Most recently, I was just asked to speak at Plymouth Kiwanis, and the member said, well, what do you want to speak on? I said, well, I've got like 50 presentations. You just tell me what you want me to speak on. He goes, well, why don't you just talk about what you do? And I stopped and I said, I have never just talked about what I do. And how I know that is one time on a Sunday, our family was invited up. We used to do this thing where the pastor at the time would invite families up and introduce them to the congregation, And my son, who was, I think he was maybe 8 at the time, the pastor asked Jack, what did your dad do? And Jack goes, we really have no idea. So you'll figure out what I do, I think, just by virtue of this. This was an interesting project for me. Jim mentioned that I'm a preservation specialist, but this kind of dives a little deeper into, how do you step back and take a look at the culture of a place? What kinds of things have created the fabric of that place? And it's more than just architectural history, it's some other aspects as well. So we'll get into that. I think it was last summer I was invited down here to talk with this group, and Jim blindsided me. I thought I was being called down to talk about roads, which we did, talk about roads and speed limits, but then all of a sudden this project came out of that. So there's a report. We're going to take some feedback from you guys today. I think Melva may be able to keep notes on that, I hope. But we'll take some feedback from you all today and incorporate that into the report. And right now it's over 70 pages, so it's a fairly lengthy document about the history and what things can be done in moving forward. And feel free to stop me at any point in time and ask questions if you would like. So this is the background to the project. Like I said, there was a committee. It's a subcommittee to the Antiquarian Society, and that's who contracted with me. They kind of went over the parameters and what they were kind of looking for out of the report. That led into some pretty intense documentation of all the resources. I'm going to call them resources. When I say resource, I mean buildings, fences, landscape features, natural features, those kind of things. And then the research that went into that, and obviously most of that was focused on man-made features. And then the composition of the report, there's a historical record. It's a fairly lengthy record. The resource identification, again, talks about the various structures, and then underneath those structures it talks about history related to that. So I think I was mentioning to Mike, I think we have something like 36 buildings that are identified, and then there's a paragraph history, as much as we could find then on each of those buildings. And then going forward, what does it look like then to preserve the village or preserve the culture or the fabric of the village? We created an interpretive plan. I would say the basis for an interpretive plan, and then also some how do you build off improvements then off of that interpretive plan, and then also building community. And that's something that I'm not necessarily a specialist in, but we all recognize that a community is more than just buildings, right? It's people, and it's what people function and what they do within that community. So things like social gatherings and things like that. Can everybody hear me okay? Am I talking loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is just a very quick history of the village, and this is from Daniel McDonald. If you don't know that name, Daniel McDonald he was probably the first or earliest historian for Marshall County, and Karen, we would be lost if we had not had Daniel McDonald, right? Karen Redinger back there, research specialist at the museum. What's your title?
Archive manager.
Archive manager. I'm going to get that right. So anyway, Daniel McDonald talks about Maxinkuckee, and he says, it's not been regularly laid out as a town, but as the merits of the lake as a summer resort become better known, it's destined to grow into considerable importance. Now, this is 1881, so he's predicting something that's not going to happen. McDonald includes in that that there are streets, 2 streets, dividing the town, east and west, north and south, and they're called Lake and Washington. Since the lake is what gives the village its names, it should be noted that in Native American terms, Maxinkuckee is interpreted Clearwater or Diamond Lake. However, one Native American, Niago, said that Maxinkuckee actually meant stone or stony, because there were a number of stones in the lake. Well, you can kind of diamond stones, it's just a diamond in the rough, right? Regardless of the meaning, it's far better than what it was originally known as Fizzletown. So here's the intersection of the streets. What you know is 18B Road. That was that was Lake Street because it went to the lake, right? And then Queen Road was Washington Street, and it actually intersected. And in the early maps, it went straight south. Did a little bit of a dog leg. What you're looking at is the intersection looking south. Of course, it's a T intersection now. But there was a community, the Washington School and the Washington Cemetery. So there was a community that the street actually went to, and then they took it out. By, I think, 1881, I don't think that it's included on the plat maps. And I'll just point out, there was a county commissioner who got the street paved, better roads are already here. So they saw people. All right, so the village was founded on a reservation. Jim alluded to this, and what we think is that probably, at least in Indiana, very likely is the only European settlement that actually followed onto an Indian reservation. So that's kind of an unusual situation. Jim talked about the 2 Indian chiefs. They kind of split the reservation. One kind of had the north side of 18B Road, and the other had the south side. And together they shared the village. The encampments dotted the east shore of the lake. And according to McDonald, the Zwagie residence and the main village was located on the Bigley property across the north side of the road from the Allegheny House. So that's, you guys all know the Bigley property, right? I'm talking to Culver people, so you should. However, William Thompson became a resident, or was a resident, a long-time resident on the east shore. And he said that, well, he actually built those cabins, and he built the cabins at what's known as Edwards Point, which, help me out, where is that again, Jim?
It's really right where the country club is.
So that was all reservation land, but we've got conflicting stories about exactly where the actual village was. So, and of course, there was a removal of those Native Americans in 1838, and then following that, we don't know how quickly following that, then the village was actually established. But this is kind of fascinating. The only time that Maxinkuckee is included separately in a census is in 1880. So before that, it's not separate. How many people have ever kind of dabbled in genealogy and looked up census records? Okay. So, and after 1880, it's not separated. So we have a snapshot in 1880 of what the population was in Maxinkuckee. It has its own sheets in terms of the census records. And here you'll see some probably familiar last names, right? The Thomas Bigley family. Eli Parker, there's a picture of his farm that I'll show in a little bit. Aaron Benedict started the first sawmill. This Oliver P. Stevens family, you're going to see that name again. Edwards family. Now this is interesting because he's identified as a hotel keeper at this census. However, the Spangler family is not. And the Spanglers actually are the ones that eventually run or operate the Allegheny House. And then the Miles families, they were farmers on the south side of the road. So I'm going to talk about resources here. And again, I kind of gave a definition of resource. It includes buildings, structures, landscape features such as the glacial hills, fauna, streams. All these things, we kind of looked at when we were doing that reconnaissance documentation. And though they're varied in construction dates and details, all work in unison to create the feel of the village. This is the fabric that, if strengthened, can provide a sense of community in built form that ultimately lead to the village preservation. So if you understand what you have, you appreciate what you have, you're more likely to preserve what you have. So Jim knows this because he takes walks along that. How many take walks out around that side of the lake and around County Road? It's interesting. If you just slow down and take a look at what's around you, I think I was out for 3 hours doing that documentation. Now imagine 3 hours stretch, just on that little half-mile stretch of road. There's a section where the wildflowers are just kind of abundant, and there's wetlands kind of on at the end of 18B Road, the west end, towards the country club side. And then there's glacial drumlins. That's the term. On the east end of 18B Road, as you're coming into the village from the east side, and those rise up 50 feet from the surrounding farmland. And then also there's ravines and woods and streams that are kind of all part of that little village. And actually in fairly tight concentration. I love this photo. It's no coincidence that this is summer and not winter when I did the survey work. But then there's the walls and the fences, those kind of structures that are not things that you dwell in, right? Or things that you use in terms of going inside. So things like corner posts that are of concrete, like this great one that's on Pat Cole's property at the corner of her property on Queen Road. And then also, something that's very familiar to people around the lake is the stone structures that were part of that. So this is one of the earliest little plat maps that we have of Maxinkuckee identified as a village. It's 1908. And see, it kind of really only focuses from about Queen Road, so that's Queen Road going north, right, going up, and 18B Road is the east-west road. And I've got these red arrows, and I'm going to show you the buildings in those red arrows. Now, some of the buildings that are on this are gone, but some of the buildings that are not shown with the red arrows, they're also still there, and they're included in that report. So this is the Overmeyer store. This is a laser pointer. So this is this arrow right here. You see it says IOOF. It stands for Independent Order of Oddfellows. So that's the Overmeyer store and Oddfellows Lodge. It was built about 1900. The building was located southeast, kind of 18B and Queen Road. The lodge and the store, the lodge would use the upper part of the building, and then the store was on the lower part. And we think it was built probably about 1900 or shortly thereafter. Obviously, it's in the 1908 plat. And if you're familiar with that section right there, you can see foundations that are still. How many of you remember the store? Okay. Not telling you anything new. Stop me if I'm wrong, okay? But only the foundations are there, and then it actually drops into a pretty steep ravine. This is the church that was mentioned. So it was the Disciples of Christ Church, built about 1888. The buildings identified on 1898, 1902, or 1908 and 1922 plat maps. So here it is as it is today, the lower hand corner, and then that picture actually came off of that film footage, right? We don't know of any other historic photo other than there was a little snippet from the 1930s. Yeah. So that's what the church would have looked like. It still has its what we call Gothic arched windows on the sides. Obviously the entry's been changed and the steeple's gone. And that would be, everybody familiar with where this is, that's on the north side of the road at the east end of town.
So Sarah right here's the renter right now. She's having.
Hi, Sarah.
I live there.
Have you seen that photo before?
No, not the top one. No.
But you've seen what it looks like now, obviously, right?
Some crazy lady lives there.
This was fun. Is this still for sale? I know it was for sale. Okay, it's still for sale. So Jeff Kinney, obviously he's a valuable resource. So I took Jeff with me one time, and we walked the little village as well. And I told him, I said, Jeff, I think that's the original school. And the more we looked at it and looked at the foundation, because we went up there and looked in the windows, just kind of looked at the layout. I know I can get away with those things. Jeff and I can you just claim ignorance and say that you're there wearing a government badge or something. I don't know. But it looks like what happened is when they built the new school in 1908. We know that they sold this building, and we know it was the Woolley family that purchased it. They just converted it into a house. And so I've looked at it. It's clearly, prior to 1908 construction. So I'm confident that this is the 1875 school. So this would have been the first school actually in the village. The first school is mentioned, was actually in Pat Cole's abstract, is mentioned being about 1,000 feet north of the intersection of 18B and Queen Road. So there was a school on Queen Road further north, and that would have been established by the 1850s. But this building's still there. It's converted school. I think it's kind of cool. Jeff said he wanted to move there now.
Attention to that?
Yeah.
The original school, I think, was at the Parker Farm.
Okay. Well, that would make sense.
Behind the house.
Okay. That would make a lot of sense.
Which actually burnt down in the late early 70s.
You think that they,
because there was a steeple on that building that burnt down.
Was there?
A school building, a building.
I wonder if, because what I read is it described it being on Queen Road. I wonder if they had moved it over and used it for a storage building or something.
Well, it would be. It's on the Parker Farm, but the corner of Queen 18B.
Yeah.
It's about 1,000 feet north of the school, was just been remodeled.
Yeah. There you go. And then this is the school that was just remodeled. So this is on the northwest corner of the intersection there. And had some trouble finding a good original photo or photo of what it originally looked like. But I love this photo because it actually shows kids outside the school. So it shows that life to a community beyond the buildings, right? And it was built in 1908. John Gill got Fred Thompson got the contract. Fred lived right across the street from it, and then he in turn left the contract to John Gill. They built that building for $25.69. And then Mrs. Marmon directed a kind of a beautification project around the building in 1916. And then, as you guys know, after consolidation in 1936, it was ordered closed, and then it became part of the Big League Orchard. And she's done a beautiful job. This is during restoration, so. And then, you guys are familiar with the Allegheny House. So we think this was built about 1855. It kind of tracks with when they settled in the township there. And you have to think about 1855. That's just when the lake was really starting to be used for recreational purposes. So it kind of followed suit that you're going to have some place to stay and lodge. If you're familiar with the story about Lew Wallace, reportedly part of Ben-Hur was written at the Allegheny House. It had sleeping rooms and a ballroom on the second floor. And obviously the porches are gone, but, you know, it would have been quite a hubbub of activity, you know, during its heyday. So the house was probably built by Abraham or Abram Wicks, Bogardus, and then owned by Peter and Harriet Spangler, and Spanglers are identified in that 1880 census. She was the daughter of the Bogarduses, and they had settled by 1865, 1881, and as early as 1870, Spanglers were assisting with operations of the old inn, now called the Spangler Hotel, and then that lasted until 1909. This is the Eli Parker farm, now the Mahler farm. Although it doesn't look like this, does it? I'll get to that in a second. This is an engraving that appears in McDonald's book. So this is from about 1881. And then you see, this was the store, okay? And then, as I understand it, as I read it, the post office was this little pop-out addition on the side. And the house, this kind of grand two-story Italianate house, is where the Mahler house sits today. So if you can imagine looking at that, right to the west of that, on the north side of the road, right to the west of that was the Parker store.
Where are we on the map? I'm a little bit confused.
This would be,
Where the big stone wall is.
yeah, that
Oh.
stone wall that,
Okay.
yep,
On
so
the
just
north side of the
on the
street.
north side of the road.
Okay.
Yep. So Parker owned, you know, the farm all back in behind there. So, you know, all the little houses that kind of are lined 18B Road today kind of sit at the front of what would be the Parker farm.
Okay.
I think the first kind of cutoff from that farm was the house that Linda lives in on that very corner, the northeast corner. Oh, Pat, I'm sorry, yeah, sorry, Pat. So, the farm was probably developed by 1865 or shortly thereafter. You know, we know that by about 1860 he was a store owner, so that store would have been built by about that time. And he had different partnerships over the course of duration of his business. When it was Parker and Wise, they actually opened a second location in Maxinkuckee Landing, so they had two locations. Obviously, they were taking advantage of people coming into off the lake from the pier. And then, as I mentioned, the post office is also here. This is the location today. So do you live in that? That's not it's your family though, right? Who lives in that house? That's
It's a
the
renter.
owner here.
It's a renter.
Okay, all right, okay. So, you know, we kept talking about this house, and I kept looking at, I looked at that engraving, I'm like, this just doesn't quite match up. Well, then we find that actually in 1932, the big house was destroyed by fire. And what it looks like to me anyway, because again, you know, I'm looking at the foundations, it looks like they kind of used most of the same foundation and built the new house where that big two-story house is at. But the barn is still the original barn. So that would date to probably 1860, 1870. Do you have anything to add? Do I have anything wrong? Tell me if I got something wrong.
We've done so far.
Do you use the barn?
Yes.
It's just, I love the stone wall. And the stone wall, the cast iron fence, the posts that are still left there from the fence, all date to that earlier Italianate home, so they are dated 1870 or whatever. And of course, you know, the original Bigley Farm was done in 1875, built in 1875. And you know, there's some early history of the Bigleys and how they came into the ownership of the property. It was actually through Edward Bigley's wife's family, the Fishers. They were the first ones to purchase, and then she was widowed, and she developed the farm, and then her son was actually who built the house and the barn just shortly after he was married, and that was 1875. He married Benedict Sawmill, and that's where the lumber came from. So, yeah, obviously, another just a great resource to have as part of the village. And we talked about what are the village boundaries? We had this conversation. Where does it really start and stop? Because it was never formally platted, right? So you have to make some determinations. And I went back to that 1880 census because they knew more about, their present history, if you will, than what we do. So I used those as kind of what are the boundaries, and the people that were living, or the people that were identified in that census, then to me became the boundaries. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
I don't know if it'd hold up in court, but that's what we use. And then, of course, what most people associate with the Bigleys, right? The Bigley Orchard. And that was built in 1929. And then, obviously, as it progressed, built other buildings.
Do you know who owns that now? Do they still own it?
Not maybe,
Yeah, John.
Are you talking about the farmhouse?
No. You're talking about this house, right? The little bungalow.
yeah,
Oh,
Tom
yeah,
Daly.
John Bigley.
Yeah, he's in there, and his sister owns the new one up 50%.
Right. The old farmhouse, that's vacant. I
Yeah,
think.
John,
Yeah.
Pickle owns that. He's the one that sold the schoolhouse too.
Right. I remember I had mentioned that Oliver P. Stevens house. So this is not the house that Oliver lived in, but his son was a physician. Oliver was a physician, his son was a physician. And I'm pretty certain that he would be the one that built this house. So this dates to about 1890. Yeah, it shows up in the 1908 plat. And then it's P.E. Stevens in 1922, and I haven't quite figured that one out. But regardless, that Stevens name was in the village for quite some time, as two generations of doctors actually lived there. Abram lived and practiced in Monterey before he came to Maxinkuckee, and then he went on to Argus. So I mentioned interpretive opportunities, or how do you take the history and make it something that people can kind of latch on to and begin to understand, as part of the village itself. So there's plenty of stories to tell, even in a village of only 100 people and 30 houses or whatever. There's still plenty of stories to tell, so you have to be kind of selective. And what do you do as you tell those stories? What represents the whole of the community and the fabric of the community, right? So I came up with 5 general locations, stories that could be told in each of those locations. And you guys are all understand like what interpretive signage is. You have panels of some kind, some kind of built structure that talks about the history. We talked about gateways so that it's understood what the village boundaries are, as a way to just kind of help further identify and bring some of that community aspect into the picture. And you'll understand why I say this last paragraph. It's important to work with Marshall County Highway Department because they have control of the roads. Because if you do anything, it's probably going to be located in the right-of-ways versus on private property. So I'm going to walk through each of those 5 locations. One would be at the west end. Kind of what gave rise to the village of Maxinkuckee is the lake, right? So, we can create a little node, a little interpretive site. My thought was on the south side of 18B Road, and work that out, and maybe do like a stream restoration because, as we all understand, the environment of the lake or the ecological health of the lake is important, and the streams feeding the lake obviously are important. So, are there opportunities to do some stream restoration? And while I was there this summer and the county did the chip and seal job on the road, I noticed that they came along and then they just kind of ditched along the roadside and kind of destroyed what was there. So that's why I say it's vitally important that you kind of work with county government as you do things, because that's obviously that's county jurisdiction. So, talk about the stories of the landing, commercial activities down at the landing, old photos that we would have from that, and all that becomes kind of an interpretive plan to, not only restore or protect wetland sensitive ecological areas, but also then talk about the history of the lake. And it's a great opportunity to talk about the ecology of the lake and the gateway sign. Here's another point. The Allegheny House is one of those that in its own right, is very historic, but also gives you the opportunity to talk about at least where McDonald thought the village was, the Indian village. But that gives you a great kind of landing spot to do that, those interpretive kind of stories, as well as the orchard. And then, what would that look like? Well, restoration of that kind of roadside edging, the stone wall that goes along the Allegheny House, those kind of things would need to be considered as part of that. And then we have talked about what would a restored village look like. Well, is that something that you go to? That might be something that's kind of like future kind of a goal of the antiquarians or Jim's committee. I'll call it your committee on that one. It's everybody else's committee until it comes to the hard work, right, Jim? But what would that look like? And then is this the right spot? And I'm not talking about the Allegheny House, but maybe some piece of land, maybe on the north side, is that even the right spot? And I think that before you get too far into that, archaeological work would have to be done, and maybe a better understanding of exactly where the village was to interpret it in a correct way. This seems like the kind of the key spot, and that would be at that intersection, because that was kind of the hub of where the commercial activity was. So, talk about that early history, the intersecting streets where Washington Street used to go, but it's not there anymore. Obviously, commerce, the story of the schoolhouse, because it's right there, would be within view. Story of the sawmill, which really is what built the community, right? And we need to have that sawmill. And this might be an area where we do something larger, something more like a gazebo or pavilion or something like that. It also becomes like a rest area, not bathrooms.
Do you know where the sawmill actually was?
Benedict owned. So if you think about Queen Road punching through, he would own like on the southeast corner.
Okay.
So kind of back in behind where the Overmeyer store was, back in that area. Which, if you look at just the natural features, you've got that ravine and you've got a stream running through there. My guess is that he probably tried to capture some water power based off of that, and they had the sawmill there. This is kind of a neat feature. There's not a lot of places in Indiana that have these glacial drumlins. So it also provides you a nice eastern kind of gateway into the community. So talking about the glacial features, Maxinkuckee School number 2, which is the one that had been converted to a house. Just education, the church is right there. So you're in a good jumping off point to talk about a lot of stories, because everything visually would be right there. And then I mentioned like another gateway sign. And then on the north end, this is the final one, you could have kind of a north gateway as you're coming into the village, south into the village. And again, you could, maybe that's a better place to talk about the orchards, that first schoolhouse, which, boy, if there was a photo of that. You said it just came down in the 70s?
Yeah.
If you look behind that print that you had of the Parker House,
Yeah.
there's a building back behind
Yeah.
the house. There's a
Little cupola on top.
Yes,
Okay.
on the outside, so again.
No, I think you're probably right.
I could go through some of our old family pictures, I'm sure there's pieces of it.
That'd be fantastic.
Someplace.
Yeah, that'd be
And
fantastic.
actually behind the house too, is in that picture, the smokehouse, when they butchered it, the smokehouse is still there. It's a stone building.
Oh, yeah, that's cool there. I love that little building, it's great. And I'll talk about kind of reestablishing what would it look like, since there's such a history of orchards around Culver, especially on that east side. What would it look like then to think about the roadscape? And do you do some things to kind of reestablish that feeling? So replanting apple trees would be the logical thing. And think of them as street trees versus apple trees, right? Although I'm not going to come down and prune them.
There's still some there, though.
There are still some there. Yep. So now here's just examples, and I always throw the top one in because that's when my kids were like this. But and I'm just pulling stuff. It needs to be unique to Maxinkuckee, not Plymouth or Culver. I think you've got a theme running with the stonework, so I would probably guide you along that direction. But the top picture is actually Plymouth's Greenway Trail system. They got those stone piers and then directional signage or interpretive signs that hang off of those piers. So that's something very simple. Could go into the right of way. Again, you have to work with the county on that, but it's something very simple that could be done that helps identify those various stories. Gateway signs. Obviously Culver invested in quite a bit of time and resources to come up with kind of a theme for their they've got like wayfinding signs, right? You guys have developed wayfinding signs down here and gateway signs. And then, as much of a preservationist as I am, I also think there's certainly areas for new architecture. So I pulled this picture out because I thought, that's what makes the fabric of a community. It's not just the historic architecture, but it's everything that, it's our time too. It's our generation's architecture as well. So, I think about the slower picture as something that you might consider for like a pavilion or gazebo, kind of, more of a modern interpretation of that. Then that would be that structure that would be at that main intersection. So it could be used to meet with friends or, have little picnics at.
The intersection of Lake Shore and 18B or Queen and 18B?
Queen and 18B, yeah. The kind of that, where I showed you those foundations are still there from the Overmine Shore. I asked Mike if that was his family. He goes, maybe.
Let's put this way.
And then just kind of general improvements. This is something that obviously we're dealing with private property. So, once you get off the roadway, it's all private property. So, just bear with me. There's ways to do that. You just encourage that with people that live there or own property there. Show them the history, get them to kind of buy into that idea of what you're trying to preserve. Especially with some simple things like stone fences, because once those kind of things go, those stone walls and that go, you start to lose that piece of that fabric that kind of make Maxinkuckee unique. Providing the photos, the history, obviously helps. Samples of what infill buildings might look like. So there's, I kind of looked through, there's potentially a dozen home sites or building sites that could be developed. So what's the appropriate scale? And I know that's a dangerous thing to get into when we talk about that down here on the lake, because there's some things that don't seem appropriate, my humble opinion, but there needs to be thought, there needs to be some thought about what appropriate infill looks like in that village. And then again, I mentioned that we're working with the county and utilities to be sensitive in terms of tree cutting and those kind of things. And then my understanding is Culver, as they participated in the Stellar program, they've talked about extending that bike trail or some kind of walking trail that would eventually work its way around the lake. Well, how do you tie into that? Because that's important. And then this is the final, building that sense of community in the village as a village. So how does that work? Well, again, kind of sharing that history with photographs, and of course the report's going to be available to people, so you'll have that, and developing those kind of walking tours and just so that people have the information in their hands. But then other community activities like social events, music on the lawn, art shows, history tours. That's just some photo I pulled off of, Google. But I do think an annual homecoming to kind of put a stake in the ground. If you were from here, come back and visit here. Like those are the kind of things that get people to kind of reconnect to their roots and then have that appreciation for their history. I think that's it, Jim. So there's the restoration committee. And who all's here? Jim, Melva's been great taking notes and being the recording secretary. But yeah, so that's it. Did I go too long? So I'll take questions or, yeah, Scott.
That's an 18-viewer section, right?
It is. It falls on the section line. Actually, the section corner. Where's Craig at?
Here.
Craig should know. I think the section corner or maybe the center section.
There's a section corner and it's headed to the top of it.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So, has anyone looked at the 1830s survey notes on that section line? Or
I should go in and take a look at the
That would be
original.
really cool.
Yeah.
The old government field notes actually reference Chief Watch's cabin
Does it? Does it show it?
as dimensions from the section.
Oh,
There we go.
There you go.
You say the top of the hill, which hill? All the way up, like a mile from the lake? or-
Just, be like Big Lee's southwest corner.
Yeah.
Kurt, as we think about Queen Road showing up in all these discussions, I wonder if an outlier bit of signage might go at Queen and 10, the original Pioneer campsite, which we've been worried about because that stone is obviously deteriorating and was sort of amateur hour in the first place. But something there on 10, where we've already got a historic marker that said, due south of us,
Yeah.
2 roads south, come to the village of Maxinkuckee. I mean, not a big interpretive sign like the others, but something that got people to turn off and at the same time took advantage of the fact that there's already historical.
There
Yeah.
is a
Site.
sign there, you're saying, at 10.
No, there's not. There's a rock that, on the site where the pioneers camped the first night, but it's on a piece of property that belonged to the academy and is now right of way, sort of.
Well, like the chief Menominee.
Direction.
Yeah, directional arrow. Yeah.
Put it there, yeah.
It's interesting. I'm I air dirty laundry, but there was friction in the committee about exactly what do you do, because if you make, and I can appreciate this because I've seen this happen. If you make too big of a deal of it, you invite problems. But if you don't make too big of a deal of it, do you actually get what you're looking for? And what I mean by that is, are you going to have a lot of visitors? Probably not. However, if you do things like interpretive signs and gateway signs, it does start to create that.
Well, visitors may slow down the traffic from going as fast as they can.
Well, that was. We did get the speed limit change.
To what?
I'm on the other side of the resume any speed sign, and
So
any
you're
speed
further-
means try to jump the hill at the top.
It was a little scary as we were doing the survey work because we're just walking in the road.
Actually, can you get them to remove the sign that says resume safe speed, because no one knows what safe speed is.
80 miles an hour.
Oh yeah, I mean,
I was gonna say.
well, trust me, I thought about that. That's at 18 being the South Queen.
I think I had it on one of the slides. If there's room to do like a biking, walking kind of trail, then everything needs to be striped so that it's striped over. And by reducing that lane width, you typically reduce speed. Now, there's still no guarantee, and of course, now that the road's been redone, traffic probably moves faster. But we did take the speed limit down. I think that went into effect.
It's down to 30 miles an hour through the village.
Yeah.
It was 40, and we put it down to 30. But you're right, there needs to be something more done with that road to accommodate trails.
I've been in it, yeah.
Is it structurally
Oh.
still settled?
It's fairly intact from the way it was.
That's hard to judge. I mean, there isn't, on the wing that goes off to the west, I think there was a second floor at one time, and there's been reduced.
As a matter of fact, you look at the picture, you
Yeah.
can see that second
Yeah, you
floor
can see that.
wing that goes off to the west.
But in terms of, I mean, it's been a while since I was in there, but in terms of trim and all that kind of stuff, I mean, as I recall it, it's all still there. I mean, obviously, you know, it's 150, 160 years old, things are gonna change for the most part. Yeah, I mean, Craig, honestly, that's probably, post and beam construction, like you would build a barn and then infill. That's what they were doing up until, well, of course with the sawmill there, it might have been a little different, but, that's how they were building homes up until about 1860, 1870, when they really flipped over to more balloon framing. You had it.
Well, I'm really an advocate for the bike path idea, and Jeff, Kenny, and I talked about that aspect. I know 10 years ago when they were looking at putting in bike lane on East Shore Drive, a lot of the main opposition was right there between 18B and 18 Road, and it's quite skinny, you know, where you guys live and stuff. And we thought, why not? I mean, it's not a matter of speed going into town, it's more a matter of safety, and we're always like, how, is it gonna take somebody getting killed on that road so we can make a bike path? Or, you know, stroller path or whatever. So my idea was always to go up 18B to Queen, and then maybe back into 18, and then see if the academy would let us cut through, you know, part down there, because they do allow public use of the waterfront, and that's gone through their lawyers and insurance in terms of walking. So, I think it would be great, and the interpretive signs would be useful then, because people would be walking and riding the
Oh,
bike
yeah, yeah.
along
Go
there.
straight across
It would keep
18
the
into
speed
the
limit
academy.
down.
Because there's actually a path. You go straight across 18,
Right,
you into the academy, they
Right.
could just not do a whole, it wouldn't take a whole lot of work. Walking wise, it's no big deal.
right.
But even for a bike or a stroller, it'd be a lot better if they could include that part of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then that part of 18B is a lot
I think
slower.
that would be critical, and I mean, it's one of my lifetime goals. Right? The other question I have is, what is your, I hate to see the village get stuck in time. So, do you have a time, like, where you're ending it? Because, you know, in my lifetime, the life was there with the 2 stores down by the landing,
Right.
where we cashed in our bottles and got our paper and got our candy and walked to every day. And,
You just asked a question, basically, what is preservation?
And Rossi's.
People, you know, I think it's been years trying to, you know, like answer the question, what is preservation? Because that's really what you're asking.
Yeah,
Well, you know, a community is a living thing, and it moves forward. That's why I said, there's a dozen lots that could actually potentially be developed. What does that look like moving forward? Is that wrong? I don't think it's wrong. You know, there's scale, that has to be considered. How many seen the big new apartments going in on the Yellow River in Plymouth? All right, raise your hands, who hates it? Who thinks it's cool? Who doesn't care, because it's in Plymouth, okay. So I have these people come up to me, being the, you know, like the resident historian, preservationist, they're like, oh, that must drive you nuts. And I'm like, I love it. I would live there. Because that is living. I mean, that's, you know, that is what a community looks like. It moves forward. It doesn't stop in time. So when you talk about it, I understand what you're saying. You know, is there like a period that you? No. What I'm interested in is we don't lose any more historic resources, right? We protect what we've got. If there's opportunities to restore what's there, I think that's great. But even as we look at what is existing, which is about 1855 with the Allegheny House, to, you know, let's just think about what's the oldest, or the newest historic
The
structure.
newest old thing.
Yeah, the newest old thing. You know, so that's 1830s, or excuse me, 1930s, 1940s, right?
and I think
1950s?
in the 40s, my mom went to big band concerts in the Allegheny House or something. I mean, it was in there.
I always tell people, you know, so the oldest building in downtown Plymouth, you know, was built in like the 1850s, and it looks like this, right? And if you were, you know, when the Reese Theater went in, which was, you know, 100 years later almost, it looks like this. You know, don't, you know, and both of them are gems. So you think of community in terms of, that's why I'm not gonna ask for a show of hands, but, you know, I know there's been criticism of the addition to the library in Culver. I love it. I think it's great. It's life. Yeah.
Cities have their city limits, towns have their town limits. Does the village of Maxinkuckee have village limits? And if it does, what's the total acreage in there? And do you know what the current full-time residency census is?
I've got yes and no answers to those. Okay, so the village was never incorporated, so we don't have a plat, right? So we don't really have a plat of the village. What I used was that 1880 census that identified the residents of a village, I put that in air quotes, as what my understanding of the boundary is. So when I did my research and my survey work, I used that as the basis for that boundary. And it's not a geographic boundary, it's really very loose. In the report, I did do, because it's public record, I included the ownership of all the structures. So that will show whether or not they're year-round residents or not. And I did not run any percentages, so I mean I could, but I didn't do that. The report just shows who's the current owner of X property.
Is your report available online, or is there places to access that?
I think the discussion is we're going to do that.
Yeah, we can put it up on the museum website.
Okay.
We have to get it finished first.
Just a link, okay.
Yeah, I plan to wrap it up probably this next week, and then I'll convert it over to PDF because there's tons of photos, and then we'll make it available. And, you know, Karen knows this. The best way to get the right story about history is to put something out there that's wrong. So, if there are things that are not correct, I mean, it's based off of the information that I had. If there's things that aren't correct, let us know. You know, certainly. There are other questions?
Kurt, is it true that the highest point in Marshall County is right in that area? No. Where is
that?
that?
At Maple Road and 110.
Yeah.
It's a little over 900 feet.
But, so, where's my Wythogan people, Karen? So, we have our own preservation group in Marshall County. It's called Wythogan. It's kind of county-wide. And when we did the restoration on Summit School, is anybody over by Tippecanoe? You know, everybody called that the highest point in Marshall County, the highest point in Marshall County. And so we started calling it the highest point in Marshall County. And what did I say? The best way to find out what bad information is when you put. So actually, you're right, Scott. It's someplace off of 110.
Yeah, right at the intersection of Maple and 110, there's a slight rise there. According to the topographical maps, it's a little over 900 feet. I always wanted to own it.
Summit, we started calling Summit, okay, well, if it's not the highest point, it's the prettiest point in Marshall. We'll take that. If you Maxinkuckee villagers want to
Well, I'm
take
the
that
highest
as
there,
well.
so I'm at the top of the hill.
See,
No,
so-
I'm the highest.
I'm up high.
Only if you, no, don't do this. As in, only if you stick your house on top of one of the glacial drumlins. It might be
I'm above the one in the picture.
on
Not
the,
at the top of the hill. Like, I'm 1.2 miles from the lake.
but on the, are you on the south side or are you
I'm on the south side.
on the south side? Yeah. So you're looking at the hills, the glacial hills.
Yeah.
The top of the glacier step farther to the east, you can see the schoolhouse off the top of that on the crater.
Can you really? And so you're gonna, that was an invitation, right? For me to come and take a look at that? If you want. Okay. I appreciate that.
In the wintertime, there used to be 20 kids sliding down that hill all the time. There's no running down.
I'll bring my kids.
There are other, yeah.
Just not to get, drumlin is a term that means hill or what?
It's a term for a glacial hill.
Okay.
Jim's the one that's said, "Kurt, you need to go, there's a term for it." He kept saying there's a term for it. So I had to go do a little bit of research on exactly what that term is. And there's a couple different terms that can be used, but this one seems like it most fits with the way that is.
I'm not disagreeing, but actually you have to find out its composition, because a drumlin is clay that gets balled up under the glacier.
That's
But these I've always thought were caves, which are just big gravel piles. As water flows into cracks and holes in the glacier, carries all the gravel with it, and then the glacier melts it leaving it apart.
all right. So it looks like one of those had been excavated at one time. Was it gravel?
Yeah,
I think you might have to change the report already.
What is the word Hames? Hames?
King.
K-A-M-E-S.
And I saw that term, but I thought it had to do more with how it was shaped than it was the composition. But
I think it's composition,
Okay.
yeah. The drumlins are pretty rare. There's some examples in New York that, in the textbook I remember seeing.
okay.
The drumlins are pretty rare.
Got a correction already. That's why I said you put information out there, you're going to find out. There are other questions. I don't want to keep anybody too long. I know we're hitting an hour, right? Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of work went into the study that he has done, and we found out a lot about the history of the area and why it was important, and the post office was there. I think it had 150 residents on its peak. And as I told you, it was mainly farmers and carpenters that were doing work on the East Shore. We mentioned the steering committee, the people that have been doing all the work in funding this guy. Obviously, we're looking for, first of all, if you don't know, Father John Holton, he is the director of the museum and doing a wonderful job there in the museum. But if you're not a member, we'd appreciate it if you would become a member of the Antiquarian Society, because we are a committee within the Antiquarian Society. And if you are a member, we'd appreciate it if you could make a donation, because we need to move forward with what we need to do here. As I say, the steering committee has been funding the research thus far. So we would appreciate it if you could become a member, and also if you are a member, we'd appreciate a donation to the Antiquarian, AHS. We're going to move forward. There's no question that we're going to move forward with this, because it's a treasure, it's a gem that's right here in the community.
So by moving forward, you mean declaring it a historic district? Because I know AHS has done that in other places.
Well, so what he said, there was tension on the committee, and there were some people on the steering committee that didn't want to go that route.
Well, I think that would be a step would be to bring that up to the community of everybody who lives there, for one thing.
There's kind of two options. There's two options in that kind of scenario, or two ways to do that. One would be to extend the boundaries of the East Shore Historic District, which is already on the National Register. The Allegheny House actually is in that district. For whatever reason, they came up and grabbed that. They didn't take in the rest of the village. Or you look at the village on its own merit. And so I will be starting my 150th National Register nomination next week. As a guy who's done this a lot, I don't know that it has terms that they use, I don't know that it has the integrity to be able to stand on its own. There's just been enough changes and stuff. That's pretty rare to get an unincorporated village listed. That's pretty rare. However, we did talk about extending the boundaries as a maybe, and that the way the report is written, it could be taken and asked for what they call a determination of eligibility. So at some point, if there's ever interest in that can happen.
Well, with that, I mean, what happens to it? Because you don't want to limit the growth of it becoming active, because the goal of it is to become an more active village again, not the other way around.
No,
You don't want to freeze it in time.
So the National Register doesn't do that. When rules come into play, it's when they have what they call locally designated districts, or like South Bend has a lot of those, and so then that goes in front of a review board. National Register doesn't have that. In fact, I give this example because it's like the best, but it's also the worst, most terrible example. The old county jail, not the one that was most recently vacated, but the one before that, 1870s, it was listed on the National Register. The county went and tore it down. I mean, there's no teeth to the National Register when it comes to that.
I mean, what you don't want to do is have it like Annapolis or some places where you have, if you're doing a restoration, it has to be like from the year it was built or whatever, and then the problem is that's crazy expensive, and so then people won't do it. You know,
National Register doesn't do that. Now you can get tax credits. It's something we talked about. You can get tax credits to do projects or grants if it's part of a district, if it's listed. But then you do have to follow their rules. So.
But there's no restriction on what you can do with your property if you're on the National Register of Historic Places. What I'd like is if anybody is interested in being on the committee, please let us know, because we want your input. And a lot of you have much more input than certainly we do. My co-chairman, Patricia Cole, she grew up in that. She was Van Scoik, and she grew up in that village, and she lives right there next to the schoolhouse on the corner, and she's the co-chair. But what I'd like is if you could become a part of this committee, because we need your input. As we're a committee of the Antiquarian Society, this is a commercial. We only have committee members that are a part of the AHS, the Antiquarian Historical Society. So I really appreciate you all coming. We're going to move ahead, and you will be receiving on the website, Antiquarian website, this meeting and all the corrections that.
I hope somebody's taking notes.
Okay, thank you very much for coming.